There are several important themes that came up in our discussion of the refugee crisis. One very big question is the issue of establishing that anyone has a right to anything we don't feel like giving them. Aristotle makes a kind of practical argument that it's for your own well-being to have everyone else doing well. But there might be many instances in which we might judge that it's not, or in which we might think so, but others think not. Just think how many historical instances you all came up with in our discussion thread in which a more powerful group decided it was in their own interest to oppress people. So one of the major steps in ethics in a major project is to try to answer this basic question. Does anyone have basic rights, and why? One of the big parts of Kant's project is to answer that question. It was historical work to get to the point where most of us have the intuition that others are owed basic rights, even if they're not related to us, even if it's not in our immediate interest. The fact that many of us have that intuition shows the profound influence of Kant and other people, it wasn't just Kant, on our thinking. There's also the tension between having rights in a moral sense and having them in the sense of other people cooperating to actually observe them. And that's very complicated and has many facets to it. You might look over the history of US slavery and think both of the following things, both of which are true in a different way. Enslaved people had fundamental rights, which were being violated because they had a moral entitlement to rights, and enslaved people did not have fundamental rights because they didn't have any actual access to any rights, and the people in power didn't recognize their moral entitlement to rights. So there's the issue of what our moral principles should be, and the related but distinct issue of the political power to actually uphold moral principles, which is always deeply contested. Another issue that came up in our discussions is, if someone has a right, we have to work through exactly what obligations the rest of us have to cooperate in order to uphold that right. What do we have to do, each of us, in order to be doing our proper part to recognize and respect others' rights? It's one thing to decide that we all have such and such a right. It's a whole other set of very difficult questions to figure out what having that right means out in the real world. Especially because in most cases, you have a whole bunch of people, all of them with rights, involved in a case, and you have to figure out how to balance all of those rights. This last issue is a good example of the important insights of virtue ethics, because it's often the case that our obligations are difficult or inconvenient, and we have to give up something we like in order to uphold rights. For example, to support refugees while they integrate into society and to fund the major institutional structures that would have had to be erected in order to help them integrate would cost money. And right there, you start to run into the edge of people's commitment to justice. Virtue ethics is in part pointing out the fact that you have to have a very good character in order to uphold the principles you believe in, and that it takes actual effort to develop that kind of character. It's not enough just to have theoretical ideas. You have to have the strength of character to follow through on them. It's important to keep that in mind. But if we are relying entirely on caregivers and communities to develop gut instincts in children, and then admired mentors to teach us as we reach adulthood, our notions of what's virtuous will be pretty entirely dependent on what our society thinks. And society can think some bullshit things, let's face it. So it would be very helpful if we had an ethical principle, a really fundamental rule about what's right and good that we could use to judge the values around us, to see if they're worth following or if they should be changed and thrown away. The next theorist we're thinking about is Immanuel Kant. Kant took very seriously this skeptic's question of whether there is a fundamental ethical principle that has some kind of right to govern our behavior, something that isn't merely an expression of the values your society happens to have. Kant was also very influential, intellectually, if not politically, in thinking about human dignity, and will use his work to sharpen our own ideas about dignity. The last philosopher we studied, Aristotle, was doing virtue ethics. Virtue ethics focuses on trying to help us become certain types of people. Kant is doing what's called deontic ethics. That's a type of ethics that focuses on what actions we should take or not take. And specifically, he's doing deontology. That's a type of deontic ethics that judges our actions based on the quality of the actions themselves rather than the outcome of the actions. The word deontology comes from the Greek words for duty, deon, plus science or study, logos. So I want to start off by talking about Kant's aims for his moral project. Kant has several tasks he wants to take on in his work on ethics. He wants to analyze our common sense ideas about morality, determine whether our common sense ideas about morality are justified, identify the foundational principle of morality, and you remember that a principle is a primary rule or law. So the fundamental principle of morality would be the most basic primary rule of morality. Give an account of what our moral obligations are and how far they extend. And he wants to do all of this without drawing on observations of human beings and their behavior. That is, try to figure out our conclusions about the principle of morality only through analysis, not through a study of how humans actually act or what we like or find desirable about their actions. First, let's talk about why Kant wants to avoid an analysis of human behavior in his project. There are several reasons that Kant gives. We're going to concentrate on two. First, Kant is looking to see if there is a moral requirement. A moral requirement would be something that's necessary no matter what. If there's a moral requirement, there's no sense in which you should carry out your moral duty if you want some other goal. Moral duties should be done in themselves. That means we're looking for a rule of how we must act. But an analysis of human behavior will never tell us how we must act. It can only tell us how we do act. And as Kant points out, looking around at how humans actually behave isn't going to get us any fundamental principles of what we should be doing. Secondly, Kant wants a rule that gets us beyond human desires. Desires might be admirable, they might not be. That's not his point. The point is that your desires, including your desires about what a good outcome for society looks like, are strongly governed by social context. For example, during the fight for women's suffrage, that's the right to vote, many of the strongest opponents were women who were very sincerely convinced that allowing women to vote, to participate in politics directly, would be devastating for the well-being of the country and the well-being of the family. So our ideas about what constitutes a good outcome can be very strongly culturally conditioned. So if we make our moral rules by basically looking around at how things are, thinking about what we like and what we don't like about it, and deciding this is a good way for society to be, this over here is a bad way for society to be, then our rules are completely relative. They're just based on our reactions to what we observe. And those reactions are strongly shaped by the way we've grown up. So any rules we come up with would really be just, this is what my society and my parents or other caregivers think is right. Why should I care what your parents think is right? As a member of a different society, why should I care what your society thinks is right? So we're looking for a real ethical principle, something that we all really should care about. And it can't be based on our judgments about good and bad outcomes or good and bad societies. Okay, in the next video, we'll start to work through how Kant tackles that project. You know the drill. Review this video and your notes, email me with questions, and when you're ready, watch the next video.